get on with some of the interesting personalities involved in this story. And the first one is Doc Ewing from Columbia University. He is one man who literally changed the field of oceanography and geophysics and gave us a much better understanding through his research and his team of what's happening on the planet. He has been held up there as one of these scientists who has changed understanding to a remarkable degree. He loved exploding things. From the age of a young child, he was one of those kids that would take every opportunity. Luckily, he got involved in the right field. He became a geologist. And his first summer job was working in the oil fields doing seismographic testing using explosions and to try to reveal the Earth's structure looking for oil. So this is his take on fellow geologists. He called them annoying fellows who spend all their time poking around, basically around little details that didn't really matter. He was really interested in the big picture. He was interested in, well, you know, what is making all of this work? Kind of like Wegener about what's moving things. Well, in those days, in the 40s and 50s, interestingly enough, geologists were pretty well satisfied that what happens on the planet, on the surface, is going to be the same as what's happening in the ocean. And it's a heck of a lot easier to study what's happening on the continents. So they basically said, forget it, we're not getting involved. Doc Ewing, of course, wanted to blow things up. And so he took his explosives to sea. He literally had a shipload of explosives, and he would fill 45-gallon drums of explosives and at regular intervals have them thrown overboard, and he would carry the proper equipment so that he could receive the echolocation using his seismographs. He had hydrophones, and he would reveal the structure, the depths of the sea, and the structure of the undersea crust, which was brand new, basically, in those days, to have someone who would take the time to do this. This was his first research vessel. This is the kind of, he would do very detailed studies, and apparently he was a slave driver. That ship was working 24 hours as soon as it left port. And actually, another geologist was saying, oh, you're at Columbia, you don't really have a dock for your ship, do you? And the reply was, if you have a dock, the ship's not at sea doing experiments, is it? So that was his attitude. And you can see this is what they were doing. This is a photograph showing the sediment core rig. You know, they're going thousands and thousands of feet down to the bottom to get sediment core. He wanted one core at least every day, on top of all the other research that was happening. So over the many years, and he had, I believe, about 4 vessels, they covered a lot of territory, over 1 million miles, and that one vessel alone to reveal what's happening in the Earth's crust. This is a series of transects that he did across the Atlantic Ocean, 6 transects, each of those with thousands of data points. And literally, the data that they would bring back from the ships was just columns of numbers. And very fortunate for him, Maurice came along. She was a fellow geologist. She was hired by Doc Ewing and became one of his research assistants. But Doc Ewing was sort of a traditionalist. He had this thing that women were not allowed on his research vessels. So Marie Tharp stuck with it, and somehow she got interested in these rows and rows, columns and columns of data. And she figured she'll try to do something with this, so she spent years and years sitting at her desk trying to make sense of some of these numbers. Thank goodness she could do this. She came up with these cross sections for those 6 transects across the Atlantic Ocean. And one of the main things that she noticed that she thought was kind of interesting was in the middle, she saw 2 parallel mountain ranges. Very, very high. It's hard to tell from looking at this, but these are on the order of the Rocky Mountains, the Alps. These are proper mountain ranges with a valley in between. Well, you know what that means? She said that looks like a rift valley, which we're familiar with. You think of the Rift Valley in Africa. And what these are is a spreading center where you have the mountains on either side and there's something happening in the middle that they really could not explain. So she said, boy, that sure looks like a rift. And so she started to think, is this evidence of something that ties in with what Wegener was trying to explain? Well, Marie Tharp worked very closely with this other geologist, Bruce Heezen, and they were both working for Doc Ewing at Columbia. Many, many hours and hours and months and years. For 30 years, they worked on these series of data. And when Heezen looked at this same data and the same information, he said, nah, this is crazy. I mean, this is scientific heresy to think that somehow this is a spreading continental plate. Well, the other interesting thing is that Marie was excellent as an artist. So she started to actually put these transects onto a map, taking these recordings of the soundings. She had more and more rich data because Ewing kept going on these expeditions, getting more and more data. And she was able to translate that into these maps. So she was the first one to map this bathymetry, or the unseen topography under the Earth's, under the oceans of our planet, which was an amazing revelation for those days. And this became crucial to our understanding of continental plates moving on the planet. Interestingly, you can find a lot of really nice information about Marie Tharp online. There have been books written about her, and she would say things like, it was like she had her head down, she was working on her data and her maps, and she kind of ignored, because there was a lot of buzzing going around, arguing about whether these plates are really moving or not. So she said, I figure I'd show them a picture of the Rift Valley and they'd get a better understanding. And sure enough, the other thing she did was plot earthquakes that have been recorded in the ocean. And they all tended to line up in the Atlantic along that mid-Atlantic ridge, right down the center. So this is what she came up with over the many decades, her contributions to tectonic theory, various diagrams and maps. But the big one that really, I think, got the world's attention, not just scientists, but general public, was looking at National Geographic in 1968, and it had her map of the Atlantic Ocean floor. And it was this, for the first time almost, that the public had had a chance to look at this incredibly detailed map showing this structure of what it would be like if you could drain the oceans. Of course, there's a lot of vertical exaggeration. She did that on purpose. She wanted to be able to show where the mountain ranges are. But you can see there's so much tectonic geological information that's in that map. And if you think of where we are today, here we are. We're probably very close to the edge of the continental plate that she has diagrammed in her map as we get close to the UK. But you can see beautiful details of the ocean. Well, so that was in 1968, National Geographic. She really got her head down, and she came up with a worldwide map in 1977, and this was published by the Naval Office of Research in the US. Interestingly enough, it was so accurate that most of it is still accurate to this day, still pertains to this day. So that came out in 1977. Well, we know that the ridge is an immensely long mountain chain exactly in the center of the Atlantic Ocean. Tall, tall peaks. It would actually be, if the ocean were drained, the largest mountain range on the planet. So the mystery is, okay, let's accept that maybe the plates, the continents are moving. Well, the really difficult part was, how do you explain the mechanism? Well, the mechanism pertains to that mid-Atlantic ridge. And this notion that new Earth's crust is being formed in the ocean floor and spreading in either direction. And that explains her mechanism. So if you think back to the diagram that I showed you of the magnetic flipping of the poles, and it leaves this record in the rocks of the Earth's crust, that's exactly what you would have. You have a mirror image on either side on the mid-Atlantic ridge, on the Earth's crust. The other interesting thing is, when you look at oceanic crust, none of it is really ancient, which was another mystery. Compared to the continents, where you have rocks that are billions of years old, the bottom of the ocean, you're lucky if you have rocks that are 100 million years old. So what's happening? Well, we realize, of course, that as new crust is created in the center, it gets pushed to the side and it's being thrust underneath the continents. So now, of course, we're talking about immense forces for plate tectonics on a scale that could actually start moving the continents. In the Ring of Fire, you've all heard of that. This is where, on the Pacific side, you have the East Pacific Rise, which is marked by that pink dotted line. That's the new formation of the Earth's crust on the Pacific side, and it's getting jammed underneath. Now, I have a little tip for you here. The Atlantic is spreading. It's growing wider, and it's actually growing wider at the pace of your fingernail growing, roughly. On the Pacific side, it's getting squeezed. The Pacific is shrinking. So if you're going to go on a cruise, you get a much better value on the Atlantic side, because it's actually going to be bigger by the time you arrive. Get your money's worth. So this is the explanation of how this circulatory system works in the planet. And we know that this is what we've seen over the past 300 million years. These plates of the continents actually shifting around. So Alfred Wegener, he was a very serious scientist until his last days. He was actually on an expedition in Greenland, and he was he was so determined that he took a sleigh full of material into his base where he had scientists working, and he stayed for a cup of coffee after several days of hiking in there across the Greenland ice, and then he just left. Really, basically, no one ever saw him again. They found him later in the year, so he froze to death at age 50 on an expedition in Greenland. The sad part is that while they did have a stamp, sort of a commemorative stamp, but in terms of being a scientist, he never did receive the recognition that he deserved. So that's an unfortunate part of the story. Marie Tharp, on the other hand, she was one of these people who, even to this day with satellites, she was so close in every respect with these maps that she was drawing that we realized that she had a brilliant ability to take rows and rows of numbers and translate it into these incredible maps. She has been well recognized over the years, and it's just wonderful to see that she's received the recognition that she deserved. And you know, interestingly enough, for those of you who are familiar with Google Earth, if you go to Google Earth, you can click on one of the layers, and it's called Marie Tharp layer. And it actually brings up her map superimposed over the planet on Google Earth. Something that's a lot of fun because you can see how closely her work mirrors what we know now through the use of satellites. So I hope you can recognize that she truly was a revolutionary woman, and Marie Tharp did a wonderful job of those maps. Well, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I thank you, Jen, and I thank you for being such a wonderful audience, and I really appreciate it. Thank you to George and all the technical crew for helping me along on these series of presentations, and I hope I get to cruise with you again. Thank you very much.